Anyway, all right. So what we did last week, we we had a brief class period, so we really just kind of introduced the beginning of James 2, didn't really get very deep, very far. And so I'm going to go back and actually, if somebody would read verses 1 through 4, we'll kind of jump in from there and pick up some of the comments we didn't get to from last time. Even though we read through these verses, we kind of started the discussion, but we'll dive back into that for tonight. So somebody read James 2, 1 through 4.
Glory to Lord Jesus Christ. Both of them meeting one and all ran the old father also comes in. It's got special attention to the man wearing fine. Here's a good to say this morning over on my feet. Have you not discriminated among yourselves?
Okay, thank you. So personal favoritism, we introduced that idea last week. And so several other things we want to mention about that and point out a couple of other passages. One, it's not the way of Jesus. So, we shouldn't reflect something within the church that's not the way of Jesus. And Mark chapter 12, what they're actually trying to do is set Jesus up, but they actually acknowledge something about him that's truthful. Mark 12, verse 14, they come to Jesus and they say, "Teacher, we know how honest you are. You're impartial and don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully. Now tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And so they're coming to bring a question, and they're trying to set him up, but they do acknowledge some things about him that are exactly right. He didn't play favorites. He did teach the way of God truthfully. And since everyone in one sense is the same before God, God is no respecter of persons. Personal favoritism obviously should have no place among the church. Paul emphasized this, Ephesians 6, verse 9. And let me get that out of the New Living. I had it pulled up in another translation. Ephesians 6, verse 9. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. And of course, Sunday night, if you were in the class, we talked about in the beginning of Second Peter, where Peter refers to himself as the slave of God. And we talked a little bit about what that relationship entails. I'm not going to go back through all of that right now. You can go listen to that when you want to. It's on YouTube. But this idea, is the Bible endorsing slavery here? That's a big hot button topic with people that want to reject the Bible. Oh, it endorses. Is it endorsement of slavery? It's not. It's just an acknowledgement of something that existed. This exists, and people are going to become Christians, and some of them are masters and some of them are slaves, and that's going to inform the way they treat each other. And he's just saying, you all have the same, you're the same. You have the same master in heaven. But a little bit more about this, the Greek word regarding favoritism or no partiality, all that kind of stuff. It's the literal translation of the Hebrew phrase to lift up the face or countenance of. So to lift up a person's countenance was to regard them with favor, as opposed maybe to casting down someone's countenance. So originally it was not a bad phrase at all. It simply meant to accept a person with favor. And that ought to be the goal with everybody that we meet. But then he goes on to explain how that the world rapidly acquired the phrase. It acquired a bad sense. It began to mean not so much to favor a person, but to show favoritism, or to allow oneself to be unduly influenced by a person's social status, or his prestige, or his power, or his influence, or his wealth, or his eminence, whatever it might have been. The great characteristic of God is his fairness, his justice, his complete impartiality. And so this wasn't a new concept for Christians, because it was included in the law of Moses all the way back in Leviticus 19, verse 15. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you're to judge your neighbor fairly. You're to treat everybody the same. So, do we make assumptions about people based on what we see? We do. I've got sometime next month, I'm supposed to go back up to the school and talk to the students about dressing professionally, or how do you need to dress for ministry? And why do we even talk about that? Is dress as important in today's culture as it maybe was 20 years ago? It's not. But does it still matter? Why?
Problems and in short. Where blue jeans.
Well, I know, and if they can pass the drug test, you're still hiring them, but because you need people, right? It's not as big of a deal today. But when you're trying to figure out who is this person, and you don't know them yet, you're trying to use everything you can use to try to figure out something about them. And you get how many opportunities to make a first impression? You get one. With any one person, you only get one, unless your first impression was so horrible they don't remember you at all. It was so nondescript that you get to make another first impression on them. You get one chance, one opportunity. And so we do make assumptions about people, and we should try not to. In the context of when somebody comes to worship, we need to try to not be influenced by what they are or are not wearing or able to wear. Because the context here is we're offering somebody a great seat because it looks like they have a lot, versus telling somebody else to sit in the floor because it doesn't look like they have much. Some more background here. People in that day, the first century, Barclay says the more ostentatious of the ancients wore rings on every finger except the middle finger, and wore far more than one on each finger. They even hired rings to wear when they wished to give an impression of special wealth. And you'll see that occasionally. A celebrity attends an event and they actually borrow some kind of fancy jewelry, or it's lent out to them to wear. It's not, they don't own it. Or somebody's going to some sort of, like, maybe a reunion, and they're going to rent them a car to go to the reunion in. Why? Or why does that sometimes happen? Yeah, we're going to rent something really nice. So when people say a show, because we've got to make an impression, you know. So we understand how that works. Well, all he's saying is people were doing that back in that day. They would try to show up with all of this rings and jewelry, and then he goes on to say, Clement of Alexandria evidently saw this as something that needed to be avoided for Christians. Clement recommended that a Christian only wear one ring, and that it should be worn on his little finger. He further stated it ought to have on it a religious emblem, such as a dove, a fish, or an anchor, and the justification for wearing it was that it might be used as a seal. And then Barclay says the church was the only place in the ancient world where social distinctions did not exist, or at least were not supposed to exist. In other words, if somebody walks into the church, they weren't supposed to see what they saw in every other social situation they walked
in. From their time, it was so much more people didn't interact.
Well, there was that, but then there was also the fact that, and we talked a little bit about it last week, the call of the gospel, it often didn't resonate with the rich at all. Why? When I'm wealthy and I perceive that I've got everything, what do I need in my mind? I don't need anything. And so the call of the gospel often rang very hollow for people who were wealthy. And so if somebody who was wealthy walked into the church, That's the person who stuck out like a sore thumb. Whereas today, that's the person that fits right in. In that day, that's the person that actually stuck out and looked out of place. And so that's the basis of that person walks in and you're going to offer him the best place. And he's going to talk more about how ridiculous it is. But the background is, at least to me, is interesting. It may not be to you. When you think about what God's plan for the church is, one of the things Paul taught was you're all one in Christ. You're all the same in Christ. Galatians chapter 3, 26 through 29, he discusses that. We discussed that some in our discussion of chapter 1. And so Barclay, he invites us to imagine a slave who's regarded maybe as nothing more than a living tool by the person who owns him. You're just like my livestock. I use you to accomplish what I need to accomplish. But that guy is now sitting next to the guy who owns him in a worship assembly. And how is that going to work? Status can still breed awkward situations today. Traveling, sometimes I'd visit churches that were located close to military bases. And I had an elder in the church tell me it was really, it kind of created an awkwardness when this elder in the church, his commanding officer ended up being a member of the congregation. So commanding officer by day, but then in the church situation, the elder is shepherding his commanding officer. So it's a reversal of sorts. And so those kind of things can still come into play today. And so it all has to drive back toward we're all the same in Christ. It doesn't matter who has more. It doesn't matter who doesn't have much. When somebody comes in, they need to see us trying to live that out. So will people see the church as a place that doesn't look like the rest of the world? That's kind of what it comes down to. He says there in verse 4, doesn't this discrimination, and that's the word the New Living uses, show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? That's a real hot button word in our world in some places. Discrimination. And he's saying, if you start doing that with people in the church, that's what you're doing. And so is the community of believers united around the principles of Christ rather than the principles of the perishing world? I mean, that's what it comes down to. Now, has our church culture inadvertently encouraged some of this through the years? What are we told, or what did some of you grow up hearing about when it's time to get ready for church on Sunday? What did you need to put on? Your Sunday best. Why is that? And what is that? Because I listen to my father. Does that come from a good place with most people? I mean, is that originating from a place that has a good idea behind it? And if so, what's the idea?
You're
Right.
you don't want to
Presence of the Lord. I need to respect the fact that I'm coming into the presence of the Lord. Now, right. And so the thing is, over time, what we would say is respectable in our culture is not, it doesn't look like it used to look. And that's okay. There are cultures, missionaries from the States go into other countries to do mission work, and that might mean you're wearing a kilt or what we would looks a lot like a dress. If that's what is the cultural norm and that's what's expected, you put that on and wear it, because you don't want to do anything that would stand in the way of you being effective in your mission. But Sunday best, can it inadvertently create a problem? It can.
trying to explain as they don't wear their short shorts to school, to church. short, like say short.
Right.
You don't wear those shirts,
Right.
but then it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter what somebody looks like when they're, I get how that's confusing.
It's hard for parents. And the one thing that what we have done through the years, the one problem it can create is for that person who has very little and has decided, he's been invited to worship, or I decide I need to be in the presence of God, and comes in and quite obviously dresses nowhere close to what everybody else does. It can be off-putting. And so it's just something we got to be mindful of. And when the person comes in, that we welcome them. And I think we pretty much are there as far as we're not going to let what somebody's wearing influence us in a negative way. I mean, we're still going to welcome them. And that's what we need to be doing. But it does, for parents and trying to figure out with the kids and the discussions and all that, it does turn into a thing for sure. I think it's probably good that it's less formal than it was years ago. But the main thing is, am I focused on the idea that I'm coming into the presence of God? And does that, if I prepared myself to do that, that's what we're really talking about. Anything else y'all want to ask or mention or add or subtract from that part of the discussion? Let me read, somebody read 5 through 7. Not everybody at once.
For in this world, ones who inherit the kingdom you promised to those. You are the poor, because you will drag you into court. Or are they the ones who slander Christ?
Okay, so call back to mind the picture that he's painted. Pretty much a full room, one seat left, the other option is the floor. Two guys come in, one rich, one obviously not. And you offer the rich guy the best spot. You tell the poor looking guy to sit on the floor. I mean, that's the scenario that he's operating within. And he's trying to remind them, what is God? Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? What does God see when he sees people? He sees everybody needing Jesus. And we've already talked about how often the gospel message resonated with people who did not have much of this world's goods. And so when they come in, God's going to honor them. Are you going to dishonor them even though God has honored them? And then he says, you're in here trying to show this rich guy the best place in the room. And who is it that gives you the hardest time getting through life? It's the rich people. They're the ones that are taking advantage of you. He says, isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? So again, why is evangelism more difficult in our country? It's because we've got a lot of rich, self-reliant people in our country. What makes us self-reliant? We're not missing much of anything. And so it's people who struggle that realize their need. And we got to be ready to help people who are struggling. And that's what James is trying to remind his audience of. One of Jesus' statements out of Luke chapter 4, in verse 18, beginning as he's quoting out of the Old Testament, but he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He's sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. I'm here to provide a solution for people who really are having a hard time getting through life. So, and then also in response to John the Baptist's question, John the Baptist at one point, he sends a message to Jesus. Hey, are you the guy? Are you the Messiah? Are you the one? And Jesus says, hey, you tell John, this is Matthew 11, verse 5, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And so the most positive response to Jesus throughout his ministry came from common Jews, people who didn't have much, those who were oppressed under the weight of, they're not only being oppressed by Rome, but even by Jewish leadership. Those are the people who are responding to Jesus. And so Is it that Jesus didn't want the rich to respond to him? It's not that at all. But does Jesus force himself on anyone? No, he's looking for people who are ready to listen, ready to follow. So James is addressing a society where the rich oppress the poor, including dragging them into court, blaspheming the name of God or Christ. It's going to come up again later in the letter. But I mean, why is it hard for a poor person to succeed in our court today? And what does money buy you? That's right. Money buys you a good defense. Money buys you good representation. Why did I mean, you all probably barely remember O.J. Simpson and his trial. Maybe you've heard about it, but you know he had the dream team of attorneys representing him, and they did exactly what he was paying them to do. They got him acquitted. He was not convicted of a crime. If it will not fit, you got to acquit. I mean, that was the one little phrase. And there's OJ trying to pull leather shrinks. He's trying to pull on this glove and making this big show about pulling on a glove. Oh, it doesn't fit. Oh, he was in. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the jury was watching, but they must not have been watching what we were watching on TV. But anyway, the point is, money will buy a good defense. So,
The legal system.
right,
So much. So much that happens.
right. Yeah, it's a tough thing. That's for sure. Um, and so in the end, what one of the things James seems to be doing here is pointing out the irony of you are pandering to the people who tend to take advantage of you. One of them shows up in church and you're just trying to treat them like royalty. And that's the people that you just need to love them. You need to treat them like everybody else and show them Jesus. And then he says, aren't they the ones who slandered Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? And that ought to be always a point, something that we remember. The word James uses here from the original language is the same as when a wife takes her husband's name in marriage, or when a child is being called after his father. Christians take the name of Christ. It's the married to Jesus metaphor. So um, why? I don't know. Maybe we've talked through it already. The next question I had in my notes: what are some of the reasons that people have always been prone to fall into this trap of maybe honoring somebody or showing more attention to somebody who we believe has resources? And I don't know. Maybe don't think in terms of somebody who's just rich, has plenty of money, because that's not all that uncommon. But maybe think in terms of somebody famous shows up in the assembly, or somebody we regard as famous. How does that person get treated? um why might we want to show them such a great, is it because we want them to come back? Is it because we want them to be converted? Is it because we want to be able to tell people, guess who goes to church with me? I mean, you start going through all the things that might come into play, and then contrast that with how much, if I treat the person that comes in who obviously is struggling in life, how do I treat that person? And am I going to treat them the same? um the famous person, I want to hear that person's stories, right? You want to hear that person tell stories. Do I want to learn the story of the person's life who's struggling? That person's got stories too, but I'm going to care about that person's stories. um and that's in my notes. Sometimes we gravitate toward that person who maybe can do something for us, or something for the church, or somehow make our lives better. And there's something about us as humans that's kind of what we do, but that's not what Jesus came to hold up. He came to point out that we all need the same thing. because we're all the same at a core level. Psalm 22, verse 2, the rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all. And so really in the end, that's kind of what it boils down to. The Lord makes them all. So bottom line, first thing we need to be doing is inviting people into the assembly. We need to be trying to get people. Don't just depend on them to somehow randomly show up. It's kind of like that I was talking about in the devotional, who is it that I've been meaning to invite? Let's get them invited. Let's get them here. So it's 7:24. I don't know that we really have time to dive in. 8 through 13 is the next section, and I don't think we can get through it. So I would rather not start it since we can't get all the way through it.